All right, the clock on the wall says it's time to get moving. Or I guess in this case, the clock on the wall says it's time to get studying. Good to see everybody here this morning. Glad y'all were able to make it. Those of you in, I don't know if you'd call it radio land or TV land or some kind of land. Y'all welcome too. Glad y'all are here with us. Streaming land, maybe that's what it is. Before we begin our class this morning, let's go to God in prayer. God, we're thankful to you for the time that you've allowed us to be here, the time that you've allowed us to fellowship one with another in the study of your word. God, may we take the things here that we learn and apply them, not just let them go in one ear and out the other, but really think about, meditate on what we hear and what we say and that we will do. Be with us now as we go throughout this class. May we do those things that are right in your eyes. In Christ's name, amen. All right, we remain in chapter 21 of Genesis. By way of quick review, if you will remember, last week we saw recorded where it happened, didn't it? All of what we've been thinking about since chapter 12 happened in chapter 21, didn't it? And that what is Isaac was born, the child of promise. We started that back in chapter 12 when God told Abram at the time, that he would make of him a great nation, didn't he? And God's been reminding him of that promise periodically throughout the time of this study. Well, it happened. And there was some fanfare with that too, as you might well think there would be. It's not every day that the husband is 100 years old and the mother is 90 and they have a son. So Sarah had some things to say about that, expressing her joy and her happiness. This time her laughing was for real. It was not laughter of disbelief, but it was laughter of thank you. I'm happy and I'm glad. Abraham too was very happy. This was his promised son, the son that God had promised would be born. And the thing, that we should remember, is that God makes promises to us, doesn't he? God does not always fulfill those promises when we think that God should fulfill those promises. Now, I think that probably the way Abraham and Sarah were thinking is that probably God should have done this like back in, chapter 12, when they wasn't so cotton picking old. But that's not how God does that. And that's the thing we see throughout his word. The things that we think God should do, he does differently. That gives a lot of meaning to the scripture that says his ways are not our ways. His ways are right, whether we think it or not. So, the son of promise is here. And, there's not other than where Sarah gives her rejoicing. There's really not a lot of big fanfare otherwise. He was there. Because pretty quick we get right on into, then he was weaned. That was 3 years. Then the trouble started, didn't it? You remember what happened? Yeah. So we're not sure. It's not really clear exactly what Ishmael did. Whether it was some sort of just taunting him, teasing him. We don't know exactly. We don't know if it was some sort of physical bullying. We don't know. But we do know that Mama was not happy about it, was she? She was not happy at all. The Apostle Paul seemed to think in his writings that he took it as persecuting Isaac. So that could mean a number of different things. Sarah, what'd she tell Abraham? Y'all remember? What did she tell him prior to that? Right, immediately prior to that. Get that woman gone from him. I don't care where she goes, but she ain't staying here. Get her gone. And then that child is not going to be an heir with my child. Now, we can say to Sarah, you was kind of mean with that, wouldn't you? We could make a case for that. Yeah. But that was part of God's plan. Because God told Abraham, go on and do what she says. I'm still going to make him a great nation. Even though y'all didn't do things the way I wanted you to do things, I'm still going to make him a great nation because he is your son. When Sarah said, my son, her son will not be an heir with my son, I don't know that she really realized that what she was really saying, that the works of the flesh and the works of the Spirit would be separated. And I think we can see that here, can't we? Isaac being the child of promise, that through whom all of the earth would be blessed because of the coming of the Messiah, would represent in my mind the Spirit. Ishmael was a child of the flesh. Sarah had talked to Abram before. Says, I can't have children, so you go on into my handmaid, you can have children through her. They started helping God, didn't they? Things never work out right when you try to help God. Sometimes we don't mean to try to help God, but we just do it anyway. Sometimes it's part of our human experience, we'll call it. We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to do everything exactly the way we ought to do it. We get in a hurry. We get antsy, impatient. So we're going to help out. And that's what they did. And now he's going to be a great nation. but he's going to be a thorn in everybody's flesh from now on, him and his descendants. We see that today. They're all a thorn in one another's side over there. And a lot of that stems from the fact that people didn't do what God told them. People decided they would do it their way. So, we got what we got. We're going to make the best of it now. So, we see that Abraham was very distressed by this encounter. He was very distressed that Sarah was kicking him out. But God told him, said, no, you go ahead. You go ahead and hearken to the voice of your wife, because I'll take care of him. I'm gonna make him a great nation too. So we see what Abraham did in verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. When she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, that was a little further south of where Abraham was, where they were living at the time. All of that was relatively close, at least in our modern means of travel and thinking and so forth. You could probably get in the car and drive that in a little while, but now, bless her heart, Hagar was on foot, and she had that 17-year-old. So, or 16, whatever he was. He was probably a big old stropping young'un, I imagine. And had one skin of water and some bread. And then what usually happens when you're out and about in the wilderness, the water run out, didn't it? Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can survive a while without food, can't you? How long can you survive without water? On a good day, about 3 days. Depends on what time of the year it is, and if you in South Georgia, it may not be 3 days. Sometimes it feels like about 3 hours. But you can't survive without water. Well, they ran out of water. And she didn't really have a line on any more water. You see, at this point, they had not learned how to drink out of the green garden hoses yet. And I'm happy to announce that I have, and I survived all of that. So we're all good. Yes, sir?
I was just going to say that this must have been a very difficult time for Abraham.
I think it was.
I think he really had he rose up early in the morning and began to face that. And in verse, chapter 22, kind of getting ahead of myself, but he had another really early morning experience.
Kind of almost makes you think that Abraham's feeling like everybody's out to get him, don't it? But yeah, I think you're right, Tony. I think Abraham was grieving at this point. He had to be. This was still, even though Hagar was a bondwoman, this was still Abraham's son, and he loved his son. Ishmael was his son for 15 years before there was another son. So you can imagine that they had probably a special relationship. I'm not sure that Abraham really saw Ishmael as that half Egyptian boy. He saw him as my son.
You know, Abraham, he could not imagine what was going to happen in that
Yeah.
next chapter.
Yeah.
Early in the morning, just like that one, had to get on the donkey and go to
Yep.
his son.
And that's gonna be a good one starting next week. Zane?
Isn't it actually written that Abraham did grieve? I don't know the verse, but I thought it was. I thought I
He was, it was, in verse 11, it says, and the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. Yeah. Yeah. God had told Abraham, don't worry about this. You go ahead and send them away. I'm going to take care of them. And then we see here where Hagar had pretty much given up. They were out of water. I don't know how long this had elapsed, how long the time had gone, but they gave out of water, and she knew that they were both done for. And what she did not want was to see her son die. I don't think anybody would. So she puts him down, so distance about a bow shot, so you can imagine how far you could shoot an arrow at the time. And then she puts him under a shade tree, and she goes off. And that's when the angel of the Lord comes up. And when the angel gets to her, it's almost kind of rhetorical, isn't it? The angel says, verse 17, the angel said, "What ails you, Hagar?" Well, I don't think he was expecting an answer, because before the answer could come, he said, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." So God was there. God knew what was going on. And God had already promised Abraham that he was going to make a great nation of Ishmael. So God is going to fulfill his promises, isn't he? So he says here in 18, "Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. In verse 20, so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife from him from the land of Egypt. Now, Paran was a little bit further south, very close to the land of the Egyptians. That makes sense to me. She was an Egyptian. She came from Egypt. And which also the next part of this verse makes good sense to me, that she took him a wife of the Egyptians. Well, why wouldn't she? She was, and all the people we already love kicked us out, so go back to my people. And I think the Bible also says that he was a pretty wild individual. So
I don't understand how come Hagar is like what I think of as a matriarch of a family. I
Mhm.
thought it's total, paternal, everything. And he's already 17, 18 years old. I thought a widow or a single woman at the time was pretty much
Well, I can tell you this. It ain't nothing new. And that's been going on for years and years and years. That goes on to this day, doesn't it?
But you know, like what were the two women who were together? Ruth, she wouldn't leave her mother-in-law.
Yep.
Naomi, Ruth and Naomi.
Yep.
And they took care of each other.
Hmm?
I mean, if they had a son, that would change that. You know, they
Yep.
would be taken care of.
There were no, and of course in the story of Ruth, all the men had died. So all they had was each other. Same thing here with Hagar and Ishmael. That's all they had was each other. So while there may have been the typical, the men did everything, well, they want none.
He was a man.
Not yet he would. Not at 17 he would. No. In our day and age, yes. That is. At that day and age, they weren't a man until they was 30 or 40 years old. They weren't considered men.
26, they can live at home and you can claim them on you. So, I mean,
You know, that's the truth.
my mama had me on the road at 17.
They were getting married and having children.
They were rather young. They were rather young. But that was the custom of those days. I mean, that was, you know, we don't, the thing we have to realize is what causes us a lot of misunderstanding is when we look at things then, instead of looking at it through that filter, we look at it through the filter of today, and it blows your mind away.
Abraham was the dad, but him and his wife basically kind of like just shunned
Mm-hmm.
him too.
Yep.
Because of it being a handmaiden child, and the child only had her to look to, really, even though he was 17.
Yeah.
You don't know how they were allowed to do, but she had to take care of him because he couldn't take care of himself out.
You know, the things that I think about when we're reading that, you know, where the Bible says he was a good archer. Like, well, he ought to
But
been
he also says he's wild too.
he ought to been out there hunting and getting food for mama, and you know, we think today, and it probably would be rightly so, the shoe would be on the other foot and he would be taking care of mom. But that was that was a different time and a different set of customs that they worked under, and it was more, she was more inclined to take care of him. Zane?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
Didn't Abraham check on him from time to time? Wasn't there an instance where he was checking on Ishmael and his wife that Ishmael had selected was not being very good to the children in the tent, and he had a saying of, well, you need to replace your steak, and he told that woman to tell. Am I right?
I don't know, that may come a few chapters later, but I hadn't come up on that yet. We'll kind of be watching,
He checked on him from time to time.
and he may have, because they didn't go that far. I mean, it was far enough when you're on foot, but it's not like they was in this whole nother country and all. So I don't know if he'd be on horseback or not.
Well, I'll have to find that out.
I'm not sure that was. I mean, I'm sure they rode them back then. I know they did, but he may or may not be. So, but yeah, we'll kind of watch out for that, and we'll see. I mean, we got through about chapter 25 or so that we still gonna have
Also, when we're
Abraham.
talking about them becoming a thorn in their side, I think there would have been some separation had they had not made an agreement later on to have
Very
him
possible.
as their servant. Remember? It's
I
not
do.
there, but
I do know that I do remember I do remember reading where when Abraham died that Isaac and Ishmael buried him. So they at least had some level of a relationship with one another. But as we get into that, we'll delve into a little deeper into that thing. So the last part of this chapter deals with a covenant made between Abimelech and Abraham. Now, do we remember Abimelech, right? Who was Abimelech? He was the dude in the chapter before when they went to his country, and Abraham says, oh, hey, tell him you're my sister. And she did. Abimelech was the king of that area, of that region. And you remember how God came to Abimelech in a dream and said, you're a dead man.
Yeah, let's go.
The woman that you have took to put in your harem is somebody's wife. And Abimelech, Abimelech had every reason to have a come apart about that, didn't he? And he kind of chided Abraham pretty hard about that, didn't he? So now these guys are coming to make a covenant. Abimelech sees that God is with Abraham, doesn't he? And we can say what we want to about Abimelech, but I think he has some level of knowing who God is, at least at some level, because he at least had to recognize that God was with Abraham, that God was taking care of Abraham. And isn't that kind of what we would like people to see nowadays? Wouldn't we like for people to see God in us and want some of it? That's what I see there. Abimelech saying, God's with you. I want to be your friend. I want to be your ally.
And the reason probably, don't you think, because remember God came to him in that dream, told him about it.
Yeah.
He said, what you've done, even though Abraham had lied and partially told him the truth, he told him, he said, hey, this is your problem.
Yeah.
And that's why he knew that God was watching over him, over Abraham. So, back up time. Yeah.
So, in verse 23, Abimelech says, now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. He reminded Abraham that he did some kindness to him too. He could have killed Abraham, but he didn't. Instead, what he did is he said, Abraham, the land is before you. You stay where you want to.
I don't think God would have let him kill Abraham.
He wouldn't. I am absolutely convinced of that he would. God had a plan for Abraham, and it did not involve being killed at the hands of Abimelech. Now, Abraham apparently was not quite fully convinced of that early on. Therefore, he told Sarah to say, I'm his sister, so that they wouldn't kill him. But the biggest kindness I see that Abimelech showed to Abraham was, you stay where you want to stay out here. I mean, our hospitality is open to you. You stay. But then, as Abimelech had to realize also, one, he did realize that God was with Abraham. And two, Abraham had a lot of stuff, didn't he? He had a lot of flocks. He had herds. He had servants. He had all of the things that would make Abimelech say, I need to be friends with this man instead of enemies with him, because he might very easily overpower me and mine. So we see here, we see a political alliance, don't we?
Well, there was also one struck up in my old footnote. It says that there was a heritage treaty formally struck between Abimelech and Abraham. It guaranteed the proper control and sharing of the region's limited water resources, and it also assured the king of the patriarch's fair and equitable treatment for years to come. And that was kind of expressed out through chapter 21, 22 through 34.
Yep. So
He actually had a treaty that was almost like a legal binding thing that he had protected.
yep. So what we see here too, and we see in verse 20, well, in verse 24, Abraham swore to him that he would respect that. He absolutely would. That they would have a treaty. That they would have a covenant one with another. And then in verse 25, Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. To which Abimelech replied, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor have I heard of it until today. So Abimelech was kind of blindsided by this. But I think the long and short of that is they got that situation worked out. They made the treaty. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves, and then Abimelech asked Abraham, what's the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set to themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. So, and then that's when they called the name of the place Beersheba, because the two of them had sworn an oath to do that. Now we're going to see this again with Isaac, and there going to be some dispute over the wells in there, and of course we'll kind of flesh through that when we get to it. But this is not the absolute end of this of the contention between their posterity. But for the time being, there's a treaty and there's a truce between Abimelech and his people and Abraham and his people. That's one reason that Abraham is known as a peacemaker. And then we read, I found this rather interesting. In verse 32, thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Now, y'all remember the Philistines? Y'all ever heard of the Philistines? Well, I think we can obviously see that they're the Philistines, but they're not the same kind of people that we read about later on. These were more of a peaceful kind of people. They were willing to have a treaty with Abraham. They were willing to get along. We see later on where the Philistines became very fierce warriors. And they were a thorn in the flesh to the Israelites pretty much throughout the period of the Judges, throughout the period of time that Saul reigned, and it was sometime into the reign of David before they finally got them into subjection. If you remember, who was Goliath? He was a Philistine from Gath. So these were some bad guys later on. But today, in this one, they were a very calm, peace-loving people. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. God had told Abraham early on, all this land, I'm giving it to you. It's yours. Go about, look at it. And there's no doubt that Abraham would pick up and move his flocks as he needed to in order to get them new grazing, get them more to eat. And this is where they've wound up. This would be in the, I guess you'd call it the South Country, closer on up into Judah, in that region. What I'm going to try to do at some point or another, I've had several of you have suggested this, and I think it'd be a good idea. I'm going to try to dedicate a lesson at some point to where all this is and all these people are. Well, maybe we can have some maps that we can flash up on the board up there and make it all kind of make sense. I think maybe we'd just do a whole lesson on that, make it see where they started, where they go, where they wind up. So I'm kind of working on that. We'll get that. We'll get that when we get that. So y'all stay tuned, and it will come up. So what do we see? What do we see in the life of Abraham? Okay. Do we see where it was all up here? Or do we see Abraham as being an actual person where he had highs and he had lows? And he had some highs again. And then he had some lows. We see Abraham as maybe a lot like us.
I think his life is, the main thing that stands out to me is it's all providential.
Mm-hmm.
He's not aware of it. We are, through the Bible, but everything in his life was providentially.
I think there are some places, there are some of these times where Abraham was aware that God was working. Maybe sometimes he wasn't quite sure exactly what God was going to do. But I think we can safely say that Abraham had faith that God was going to take care of him. And even that maybe sometimes was up and down some. But overall, I think we can safely say that Abraham knew that God was taking care of him. And I think we can also safely say that Abraham knew that at some point God would fulfill his promises.
Y'all find the thing too, that he was human. And
Absolutely.
Not it only does it, that shows you how strong his faith is.
I think that is the reason why we can all relate with Abraham.
Yeah, 'cause
He had great faith, but he was not perfect. He didn't do everything perfectly.
he had a wife that was on his head because she couldn't have kids.
She was plumb mean sometimes, if you don't know the truth of the matter.
And then that plan blew up and she blamed him.
Yeah, she was just a mean woman.
And then, I don't know what I've done. I really, well, God said, come kill your son. No, I couldn't really kill him.
Yep. Next week, I want y'all to really look into that chapter 22, because next week is going to be, I guess you could say it will be the culmination of Abraham's life and his life of faith. It's going to be the finale, I guess you could say. So we'll get into that next week. Probably we will not get all the way through that in one lesson. There's a lot of stuff there, a bunch of stuff. Anybody else want the last word before we close? All right. Thank y'all for being here this morning. And we'll pick up next week with some more. Thank y'all.